In the sweltering Brazilian summer of 1948, a locomotive grinding along the most cursed railway in South America shuddered to a halt deep in the Amazon basin. The crew leaned from the cab windows, expecting downed timber, washed-out track, the ordinary treacheries of a railwayman called the Devil's Railroad. What they found instead, or what legend insists they found, would become the most retold snake story in Brazilian history. A tale that spread from riverboat to fazenda to city newspaper, growing with each retelling like the Amazon itself grows over everything left unguarded. The men who allegedly witnessed it never fully agreed on the details. Some said it measured 20 meters, others whispered 30. A few, in later years, when the story had fermented long enough, claimed 40, but they agreed on one thing. The creature that lay across those iron tracks was unlike any snake any of them had ever encountered, in a land where extraordinary snakes are considered ordinary facts of life. What the jungle whispers about that morning has never been fully confirmed and never been fully dismissed. And in the Amazon, that particular state of uncertainty is the closest thing to truth the forest ever offers. To understand why this story happened, where it happened, and why it lodged itself so permanently in Brazilian memory, the journey must begin decades before 1948, with a railway project so catastrophic that the jungle itself seemed to be fighting back against its construction. The Madeira-Mamoré Railroad, known across the Amazon basin as the Estrada de Ferro do Diabo, the Devil's Railroad, was conceived in the last years of the 19th century as an engineering solution to one of geography's cruelest jokes. Bolivia, landlocked and desperate to export the rubber that had made the Amazon suddenly enormously valuable, needed a route to navigable water. The rivers were there, but 19 cataracts and rapids made the Madeira impassable for the hundreds of kilometers that mattered most. The solution, cutting a railroad around those cataracts through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, was elegant in theory and horrifying in practice. Between 1907 and 1912, estimates suggest that somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 workers perished during construction. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, accidents, jaguar attacks, and yes, encounters with anacondas and other serpents claimed workers from Bolivia, Brazil, the Caribbean, Spain, Italy, and the United States. Every railroad tie, locals said, had cost one human life. The forest swallowed the dead and kept working. The railway that emerged from this carnage stretched 364 kilometers, connecting Porto Velho to Guajará-Mirim, in what is now the state of Rondônia. It had cost a fortune in gold and blood to build, and almost immediately after its completion, it began to become obsolete as synthetic rubber eroded the Amazon boom, and the rivers that had defined its purpose slowly shifted in importance. By the time 1948 arrived, the Devil's Railroad was a ghost of its ambition, still running barely through a jungle that had never forgiven its existence. The men who rode its trains knew they were operating in territory the forest considered contested. If you find yourself captivated by the hidden histories that official records never quite contain, and the Amazon legends that survived every attempt to dismiss them, this is exactly the kind of investigation we pursue on Secrets of the Amazon Jungle. Consider joining this journey. The forest has more secrets than any single expedition can exhaust. Now, the creature itself. The Amazon has always been home to the green anaconda, Eunectes murinus, the heaviest snake in the world by any honest measure. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin have known and respected the anaconda for longer than recorded history reaches. The Yanomami, who inhabit the northern reaches of the Amazon between Brazil and Venezuela, speak of the anaconda as more than an animal. It is a spiritual force, an embodiment of the river itself, capable of taking forms beyond anything a biologist's measuring tape could capture. The Desana people, whose territory spans parts of the Colombian and Brazilian Amazon near the Rio Negro, maintain oral traditions about anacondas of world-spanning size, cosmic serpents whose bodies form the rivers themselves, whose shedding of skin creates the annual floods. These are not stories told to frighten children. They are cosmological explanations, attempts to capture in narrative what the sheer biological abundance of the Amazon demands some accounting for. When outsiders arrived and began dismissing such accounts as primitive exaggeration, they missed something the forest had been communicating all along. In the Amazon, the line between the natural and the mythological is genuinely, measurably thinner than anywhere else on Earth. Accounts of extraordinarily large anacondas began filtering into European and North American records almost from the moment colonizers entered the basin. Francisco de Orellana, whose 1541 journey made him the first European to navigate the Amazon's full length, returned to the Spanish court with stories that strained credulity even by the standards of an age hungry for New World wonders. His chronicler, the Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, recorded encounters with river creatures of implausible dimensions, accounts that were dismissed as fever dream exaggeration for centuries before some began looking more carefully at what the Amazon actually contained. In 1906, a British-American explorer named Percy Fawcett, who would later achieve his own infamy vanishing in the Brazilian interior, reported shooting an anaconda along the Rio Abuna in what is now the state of Rondônia. Fawcett measured the creature at 18.5 feet exposed above water and estimated a further 17 feet submerged, suggesting a total length approaching 11 meters. He reported this finding in official correspondence to the Royal Geographical Society and was met with a response that oscillated between polite skepticism and outright ridicule. Fawcett himself, a man not known for modesty of imagination, described the encounter as the most impressive confrontation with wildlife he had ever experienced. The society filed the report and moved on. The jungle noted the dismissal and kept its secrets. Through the rubber boom years, workers along the Madeira and its tributaries collected their own accounts. Seringueiros, the rubber tappers who lived solitary lives deep in the forest, spoke of anacondas capable of capsizing canoes, of pulling cattle into flooded tributaries, of lying across trails so wide that a man could not jump them. These men were not fabulists. They were practical workers in a dangerous environment, and their reports were consistent across regions and decades. Consistent enough that by the time the 1940s arrived, the possibility of anacondas substantially larger than any museum specimen had accumulated its own weight of testimonial evidence. The Madeira-Mamoré Railroad had been struggling through its twilight years when the incident now known simply as the Anaconda that stopped the train reportedly occurred. The exact date remains slippery. Some versions say early morning, some say the dead heat of midday, some say dusk was already gathering when the engineer brought the locomotive to a halt. What the various accounts agree upon is the location, somewhere between Porto Velho and Abuna, along a particularly low-lying stretch of track where the Madeira's influence flooded the surrounding forest during wet season and deposited creatures from the river on the land. The train crew spotted the obstruction from a distance. Accounts differ on whether it filled one rail to the other, or whether its girth was such that it draped over the outer edges of both rails and still had body to spare on either side. The engineer, whose name appears variously in different tellings as José, Manuel, and in at least one account as simply the old man from Minas, applied the brakes and brought the locomotive shuddering to rest. The crew debated what to do about the obstruction. Some accounts claim workers attempted to move the anaconda and it responded. It raised its head, described in one version as the size of a shovel blade, and regarded the men with the particular calm indifference that only truly enormous predators can project. In another version, it did not move at all, simply lay, immovable as a fallen tree, indifferent to the noise and steam and human alarm, as if the railroad had been built through its living room and it had chosen to make clear whose living room it actually was. The crew returned to their locomotive and waited. After a period described as anywhere between 20 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the teller, the snake, if indeed it was the snake and not the jungle's patience that yielded, moved from the tracks and slid back into the flooded forest alongside. The train continued to Porto Velho, and somewhere in the telling of that journey, in the eating houses and bars of Porto Velho, where railroad workers gathered to exchange the accumulated impossible experiences of lives lived in the Amazon, the story began to grow. Measurements expanded with each retelling. The snake's behavior became more dramatic. By the time the story had completed its first circuit of the region, the anaconda had been transformed from an impressive serpent into something approaching a force of nature. Not merely a large snake, but an entity so vast that the locomotive's iron certainty was helpless against it. Here is where the Amazon performs one of its most reliable magic tricks. The story became the region's truth, not because everyone believed it literally, not because the measurements were taken seriously, even by the men who gave them, but because the story captured something genuinely, measurably true about life on the Devil's Railroad, that the jungle was always the larger power, that the forces pressing against human infrastructure were real and formidable, that something out there in the flooded forest beside the tracks was more ancient and more certain of itself than any locomotive built in the outside world. This is the moment to ask what the science actually has to say, and to note, carefully, that what the science says is more interesting than either strict believers or strict skeptics tend to acknowledge. The green anaconda, Eunectes murinus, is a documented fact, and documented facts about it are already extraordinary enough to strain ordinary imagination. The largest reliably measured specimen in scientific record reached approximately 5.2 meters and weighed roughly 97 kilograms. Most herpetologists accept that the upper range of the species, animals that reach full maturity in optimal conditions in the central Amazon, can plausibly reach 7 meters. 7 meters. Stretched across a set of standard gauge railroad tracks, which measure approximately 1.43 meters between rails, a 7-meter anaconda would extend more than 2.5 meters beyond the outer rail on each side. That is not a small animal accidentally wandering across the infrastructure. That is a sovereign creature exercising geographic rights. Western science, to its credit, does not dismiss the possibility of larger specimens. It simply notes that none has been reliably measured. The Wildlife Conservation Society has maintained an open offer, several $1,000s for documentation of an anaconda exceeding 30 feet, since the 1990s. That offer, as of every available record, remains unclaimed. Unclaimed does not mean impossible. The Amazon covers more than 5.5 million square kilometers, much of it impenetrable to the kind of observation that would produce the documentation a reward requires. If this investigation into the Amazon's biological possibilities is speaking to something in you, that sense that the world's largest wilderness cannot possibly have revealed everything it contains, then the secrets of the Amazon jungle channel exists precisely for that feeling. Every species described as myth before its discovery, every legend that turned out to have a living heartbeat, those are the stories explored here. The biology of anacondas helps explain, at least partially, how the 1948 story could have a genuine foundation, even if its measurements were exaggerated by 10 or 12 meters. Anacondas are semi-aquatic ambush predators. They prefer flooded forest and river margins, precisely the terrain that bordered the Madeira-Mamoré Railroad along its lower sections. During the wet season, when the Madeira floods its banks and inundates the surrounding forest for miles in each direction, Anacondas move freely between river and land, following prey into habitats that are half water, half jungle. A large animal, moving from flooded forest to find a drier resting place, would naturally cross any raised embankment in its path, including a railroad embankment that represented, in the wet season, one of the few strips of ground above water level for miles. That it happened is entirely plausible. That what happened was precisely what the legend describes: an anaconda so large it defied every scientific record and stopped a train through sheer dimensional impossibility, is where the story migrates from natural history into mythology. And yet mythology, in the Amazon, is rarely simply invented. It is usually inflated truth, the genuine encounter with something extraordinary, expanded by the human need to match the experience to the scale of the landscape that produced it. Consider the physics of the encounter from the crew's perspective. These were men who had spent careers on the Devil's Railroad in country that had killed thousands of their predecessors. They were not sheltered observers encountering wildlife for the first time. They were practical workers in one of the most biologically intense environments on Earth. When such men declared an anaconda extraordinary, the declaration carried a different weight than an excited tourist's claim. And yet their declaration has been lost to time without documentation, preserved only in the oral tradition of the communities that lived along that railway, and in the versions of the story that Brazilian journalists and folklorists eventually wrote down, years after the event, filtered through multiple retellings, with all the accumulated elaboration that implies. The absence of physical evidence is not surprising. The Amazon consumes physical evidence with a thoroughness that makes forensic investigation nearly impossible. A snake that was alive, even a very large one, would have left no trace on a railroad track that saw daily traffic in a climate where organic material decomposes within weeks. No photograph was taken, or if one was taken, none has surfaced. No measurement was recorded in any official railroad document that subsequent researchers have been able to locate. The witnesses, whoever they actually were, are long dead. The railroad itself was officially closed in 1972 and is now largely reclaimed by the jungle, its iron rails rusting back into the red earth, its story preserved only in the region's collective memory. What researchers and journalists have found when they've gone looking are other stories. Not the story from 1948. That specific incident remains undocumented beyond oral tradition. But stories of anaconda encounters along the Madeira-Mamoré corridor that span the entire operational history of the railroad, from construction in the early 1900s through the final years of service. Workers who described finding anacondas beneath the station platforms at Guajara-Mirim. Engineers who reported running over something on the tracks in the night that made the locomotive shudder, like hitting a boulder. Indigenous guides who flatly refused to walk certain sections of track after dark because of what they knew lived in the flooded forest on either side. These accumulated accounts form what researchers sometimes call a tradition of encounters, not proof of any single extraordinary animal, but evidence of a region where encounters with extraordinary animals were sufficiently common to become a cultural assumption. The 1948 story did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a century of documented human experience in a corridor of the Amazon that was, and remains, one of the densest habitats for anacondas on the continent. If you've stayed with this investigation this far, it suggests you're someone who understands that the most interesting truths live in the boundary between documented fact and the stories a community refuses to abandon. That boundary is where the secrets of the Amazon jungle channel lives permanently, and where every investigation eventually leads. Modern herpetology has not given up on the possibility of anacondas larger than any specimen in museum record. The logistical challenge of catching and measuring a large anaconda, a creature that spends most of its life submerged in tea-colored water in flooded forests, accessible only by boat during wet season, means that the sample of measured specimens is almost certainly not representative of the species' full-size range. The largest captive anacondas suggest that 9 meters is biologically achievable. The nutrient density of Amazonian ecosystems and the anaconda's indeterminate growth pattern, in which growth never fully stops over a long life, creates theoretical room for animals that would make museum records seem modest. The Wildlife Conservation Society's standing offer, mentioned earlier, has an interesting implication beyond its obvious one. It implies that those who study anacondas professionally believe a 30-foot specimen is possible enough to be worth paying for documentation. 30 feet is approximately 9 meters. 9 meters of snake on a railroad track would, by any honest assessment, stop a train. Not because the locomotive couldn't technically push through it, but because a train crew confronted with a living creature of that scale would exercise the kind of caution that registers in the memory as an impossibility overcome. They wouldn't push through it. They would wait. The indigenous communities of the Madeira River Basin have their own response to the debate between scientific skepticism and folkloric belief, and it is characteristically succinct. The anaconda does not require outside verification to be what it is. The river does not need a scientific paper to be wide. The forest keeps the large things hidden, not because they are rare, but because the forest keeps everything according to its own logic, and that logic has never required human consensus. The Madeira-Mamoré Railroad Corridor has one more chapter to add to the anaconda story, a chapter that began not in 1948 but in recent years, as the railway's abandoned right-of-way has reverted entirely to jungle. Researchers studying the recovering ecosystem along the old rail line have noted something interesting. The flooded forest sections, the same low-lying stretches where the old stories cluster, show anaconda population densities that surprised even experienced herpetologists. Not single animals, but groups of them, using the raised embankment terrain exactly as predicted, resting above flood level during wet season on the former railroad bed that now provides one of the most reliable dry surfaces in miles of inundated forest. The old Devil's Railroad, now entirely consumed by the forest that always resented it, has become an anaconda highway. The iron has rusted back to earth. The cross ties have decomposed. The stations are trees, and the anacondas that were there before the first spike was driven are still there, following their own ancient routes through the flooded forest, occasionally crossing the slight raised ridge that was once a railroad, and is now simply a convenient dry path through their wet season world. One more layer lies beneath the story that this investigation has only partially lifted. The Amazon basin is not a static environment. It is a geologically recent formation, geographically speaking, in the context of evolutionary time. The megafauna that inhabited South America before the end Pleistocene extinction events included creatures of genuinely extraordinary scale. Ground sloths, the size of elephants, glyptodonts like living tanks, and Titanoboa cerrejonensis, an anaconda relative that lived approximately 60 million years ago and reached confirmed lengths of 13 meters. Titanoboa is extinct. The scientific consensus on this point is not seriously disputed. But the evolutionary lineage it represents, large constrictor snakes thriving in the nutritional abundance of tropical river ecosystems, is not extinct. It simply became smaller as the climate cooled and prey availability changed. The question that some researchers pose, quietly aware of how it sounds, is whether the Amazon's most isolated refugia might harbor populations of Eunectes murinus that have maintained ancestral size ranges that the colonized, measured and monitored portions of the basin no longer exhibit. This is speculation. Good science labels it clearly as such. But good science also acknowledges that the Amazon basin contains roughly 40,000 plant species, more than 1,300 bird species, and new vertebrate species are still being formally described every year. In an environment that has been yielding biological surprises continuously since European science first encountered it in the 16th century, the declaration that no further biological surprises remain would be the most unscientific statement possible. The 1948 story floats above all of this context like a seed on the Amazon's slow currents. It is not provable. It is not disprovable. It belongs to a category of knowledge that the Amazon specializes in, the witnessed but undocumented, the experienced but unmeasured, the real in every dimension that matters to the people who live there, and uncertain in every dimension that matters to the people who don't. What is certain is this: somewhere along the former right-of-way of the Madeira-Mamoré Railroad, in the flooded forest beside what used to be tracks and is now returning inch by inch to the Amazon's own geometry, anacondas are moving through the water. They are moving as they have always moved, on routes that predate every human project in the basin by millions of years. Some of them are large enough to stop traffic, not metaphorically but physically, measurably, in ways that would explain why a train crew stopped their locomotive and waited, without any documentation required. And somewhere in the deeper sections of the Madeira's flooded tributaries, the blackwater creeks that drain territories no biological survey has penetrated, the igapo forests that flood so deeply in wet season that they become effectively inaccessible for months at a time, the possibility exists of animals that the scientific record has never reached and the local record has never doubted. The Amazon doesn't confirm or deny them. It simply continues in the way it has continued through every human civilization that has risen and fallen around it, keeping its own inventory by methods that predate the concept of documentation. The story of the anaconda that stopped a train is, at its heart, a story about scale. Not just the scale of one snake measured against one set of railroad tracks on one morning in 1948, but the scale of a living system so vast and so old that its largest inhabitants and its most dramatic events can pass without leaving any trace that the outside world can verify. Only the memory of the people who were there, standing between the locomotive and the snake, waiting for the jungle to decide what happened next. The Amazon keeps this story, as it keeps all its stories, beneath a living canopy that no satellite fully penetrates, in the water memory of rivers that have been running since before the first human voice named them. Perhaps the 1948 event happened exactly as legend insists. A locomotive halted before a snake so vast it defied every measurement. A crew that waited with the particular patience of people who understood they were not the largest thing in the forest. Perhaps it was a very large but scientifically unremarkable anaconda, transformed by the storytelling tradition of a river culture that has always known how to translate the extraordinary into the mythological. Or perhaps the truth lies where Amazonian truth most often lives, in the space between what can be measured and what has been witnessed, in the testimony of people whose lives gave them every reason to know exactly what a large snake looks like, and who looked at this one and reached for larger words than they had ever needed before. The Devil's Railroad is gone. The jungle has taken back every meter. But the anacondas remain, older than the railway, older than the rubber boom, older than the names given to the rivers they share with no one. And somewhere in the flooded forest beside the Madeira, in the wet season's brown waters that connect river to forest and forest to sky, something moves that makes the water remember a morning in 1948 when a train stopped and waited, and the forest decided what would happen next. The Amazon keeps its secrets beneath a living roof no satellite fully penetrates. Perhaps that is how it should remain. Some mysteries preserved not for lack of answers, but because the question itself is the gift the forest offers. Or perhaps one day the jungle will choose to reveal what it has hidden for millennia, and some future crew on some future errand through the green infinity will encounter something on their path that makes them stop and wait and understand at last exactly how large the world they thought they knew has always been. If you're drawn to the mysteries that maps can't mark and science can't yet explain, there is a place where every whisper the rainforest allows to escape is followed to its source. Every vanished explorer, every legendary creature, every civilization the canopy swallowed, the secrets are here, waiting for those patient enough to listen. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and venture deeper.